We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Welcome back to Space Junk Podcast, the co-video COVID edition. And today I'm joined by my very favourite Professor Stephen Freeland. Stephen is a Professor of International Law, specialising in international space law at Western Sydney University. Stephen, how are you?
I'm really well. Hi, Annie, and hello to everybody. I'm well. I wish I was where my background suggests I am, but like everybody, I'm at home, and I wish everybody well in these challenging times. Interesting that what we're going to talk about at least means that we're not necessarily, although I think there's a bit of an element in there, but we're not necessarily talking about the subject that's on everybody's minds at the moment. So that's, in one sense, a welcome distraction. But I think there's, and maybe we'll talk about that. I think there is some sort of relationship about the economic situation that not only the United States, all countries, but certainly the United States, with its proposed $1 trillion package to deal with the current virus. I suspect that to a certain degree, some of the announcements made, this particular announcement made about resources and the recent NASA statements about the Gateway project and Artemis, I suspect everything that all major projects all around the world are impacted to a certain degree by this incredibly unforeseen but dramatic change in the economies of the world and every major country. So we shall see. But thank you for asking. I'm well. I hope you're well, and I hope everybody who's listening is safe and well and doing all the right things.
Absolutely. Stay home, friends. Unless, of course, you're a health professional, in which case, thank you so much for all of your hard work.
Absolutely.
Now, Stephen kindly agreed to talk to me today about the executive order that came out from the US a couple of days ago now, which was about resource use in space, particularly the moon. And I thought it would be great to get your thoughts on what it all means and whether or not we should be worried about it, what we ought to think about it, and how to contextualize it within everything else that's going on. Is that a broad enough statement to get you started?
Oh, it is. And there's obviously a lot to talk about. And I already saw your excellent initial response to it yesterday, which I thought raised a lot of really interesting and important points. So thank you for that, Annie. Well, it's a significant announcement in the sense that it deals with an issue that has been ratcheted up in terms of its significance over recent years. But due to the circumstances that we all find ourselves in terms of the COVID-19 situation, the discussions on this particular issue at a multilateral level, which were due to take place in Vienna literally in the last couple of weeks at the legal subcommittee of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is, for those who don't know, the UN body that really is charged with looking at, amongst other things, legal issues around space. Those discussions were, for obvious reasons, postponed and will probably now be rescheduled, I presume, for next year. I have, as you know, the honour with my dear friend Andre Mishtal of being appointed as the co-chair of those discussions. And I understand that the United States clearly would have been engaged in those discussions in Vienna, and no doubt would have made their position quite clear at those discussions, along with all of the other 95 member states of COPOS who would have attended. Given the cancellation of those discussions, and given that the NASA has recently, just a couple of days before the executive order that you mentioned, NASA issued its plan for the sustained lunar exploration and development. And in that NASA statement made references also, albeit that the report was mainly dealing with some other issues about the Gateway project, but in that NASA statement had made reference to the development of an appropriate, safe process for extraction of resources. So this, if you like, executive order, which came 3 or 4 days later, follows on from that and gives some clarity. So in that regard, it's part of another picture that the United States is publicly putting forward about its proposed plans for lunar and ultimately Mars exploration and everything associated with that. But it's still a significant announcement because of its forthrightness, because in a sense it in one sense purports to be absolutely crystal clear as to what the position of the United States is. On the other hand, it doesn't necessarily really add anything that we didn't already know from previous statements and developments in the United States. But clearly, it focuses the mind. And as you know, other countries are already beginning to respond. And those responses will clearly, some may be supportive, some, and we've seen already some, will not be supportive of this United States executive order. And so to a certain degree, for me, it highlights even more the need to work out an appropriate way that we move forward on this issue. And it highlights the fact that there are considerable differences, perhaps in perspective, but in my view, at least ultimately in the end, that doesn't necessarily discount the possibility that we need to move forward on having some sort of way that we all understand this issue should be progressed.
So in that sense, what I'm hearing is that potentially the executive order that came from the White House a couple of days ago on resource use in space is not itself as momentous, I suppose, as the bluntness of its wording might suggest. Because I think when you initially pick it up and read it, you think, oh my God, it's short, it's sharp, it's to the point, this must mean something considerable. But on second or third reading, I completely agree. You start to realize that actually it doesn't say much that hasn't been said before. And considering the laws that the US passed in 2015, I think it was potentially already clear that that is the perspective that the US takes on the matter of resource use. And again, when it comes to the Moon Agreement, it's probably, given that the US has never signed up to the Moon Agreement and has never expressed a desire to, I guess in a sense it would be unrealistic to expect that they would seek to use the provisions of the Moon Agreement to form the sort of multilateral engagement that they were alluding to wanting to engage in the executive order.
I think that's absolutely right. Clearly, though, it is framed in fairly strident terms. Absolutely, that is the case, and absolutely, there will be reaction against it. And there may also be reaction in support, although I've not heard yet from any countries actively supporting this statement, but it's early days. And of course, wouldn't it be great if every country in the world agreed on the way forward now? Yeah. But it's not the case. It's not the case in a whole range of areas, and this is just one of those examples. But there are some things in here that I know you pointed to yesterday, but one or two other things too that I think are worth highlighting.
Sure.
One important feature for me, and we will talk about the Moon Agreement, but perhaps for me, the really important feature was the, again, in these blunt, unequivocal terms, the absolute support for the Outer Space Treaty. And that is interesting because in the past few years, a number of politicians in the United States have actually advocated that the United States withdraw from the Outer Space Treaty. And in fact, I've written with a dear colleague of mine an article on what if, what would the world be like if the United States left the Outer Space Treaty, and clearly that would not be a good look in terms of a whole range of issues. So, one of the positive features, and I'm not trying to be too Pollyannish, but one of the positive features of this statement is, okay, it makes it clear what we've always known: the United States has never and will not support the Moon Agreement. But at the same time, they make it clear that any regime, or maybe that's not the right way to use the right expression, but any way forward in terms of the exploration, exploitation and utilization of space resources should be governed in accordance with the principles of the Outer Space Treaty. In fact, in that NASA statement that I referred to earlier, I've just written the quote down here. It refers to, and I'm just quoting now, a predictable and safe process for the extraction and use of space resources under the auspices of the Outer Space Treaty. So, and the executive order, as you know, reinforces that commitment to the Outer Space Treaty. And that is interesting because over 100 countries and virtually every member of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. I think there's maybe one that is only a signatory, not a party of the Outer Space Treaty, but it's virtually every country is a party. The treaty itself, the Outer Space Treaty, has principles that have served us really well and that do and are relevant to any activity in space, including activities in relation to the exploration, exploitation, and utilization. So, if you put those two together, the United States is saying, now you can agree or disagree with what they're saying, and you and I personally are great fans of the Moon Agreement, and our country, Australia, is a party to the Moon Agreement. But putting aside what we personally think about it, they are not saying there is no law. What they are saying is, to the extent, this is their view, of course, and their interpretation, to the extent there is binding law dealing with these sort of activities, they are not to be found in the Moon Agreement, but the Outer Space Treaty will apply, and the principles in there. So I think that is, when I say that's a positive, it is a fact, but that is being reasserted. So I think that's something that people overlook or have in their initial responses overlooked. I know you haven't, but others have overlooked this by saying, oh my goodness, they're declaring the Moon Agreement is completely persona non grata. There's no law. That is not what they're saying. So I think that's quite a positive thing. Why have they done it now? Well, as I said rather blithely in my introductory comments, the world has changed, and the world is changing quite quickly, and the economies are changing. And I think, I don't know whether this was planned to be released when it was released. Obviously, it may well have been. But the fact is that, like the 2015 law that the United States passed under the Obama administration, that law was designed, amongst other things, to give private entities that may consider being engaged some source of comfort, at least under US law. And I think one of the side effects, or maybe one of the direct intentions, who knows, of this statement is also to say to private enterprise in the United States, this is something that, as an activity, we support. Why is that important? Because it may well be, and now I am speculating, but it may well be that because of this changed economic environment that we will all find ourselves in, including major governments, that there may not necessarily be public resources available that perhaps there might have been in November or December. NASA has asked for significant amounts of money, for example, not only for the Gateway and Artemis projects, but also an increase in its normal budget. 4 months ago, that the availability of that money perhaps was more likely, although Congress, of course, would still look at it closely. But the availability of that money was certainly more likely than it is 3 months later now because of the intervening circumstances. So I think part of this executive order is for internal consumption, although it clearly has international impacts as well. But for internal consumption, to say to private enterprise, this is still an activity we support, perhaps you might think seriously and really keep on developing and investing in this as an idea. I don't know whether that makes sense to you, but I think there's a lot of money that is required for any of these sorts of activities, with a long way to go, and the economic situation has changed. So perhaps that also may be seen as one of the rationale for this.
I think economically it makes perfect sense. And it's not something I had thought about until now, but just thinking about it, if I look back on the space race that happened, that was in large part funded by government money being funneled into research and development. And the development that came out of that, the science and the technology and so on, has been incredibly useful for us as a society, in addition to the great achievements of putting someone on the moon. So I think it makes sense that in 2020, with limited government resources, I think globally, after this coronavirus pandemic, that turning to the private sector and saying, well, we'll create the conditions under which you can have confidence and you can invest, is probably going to be a way that economically countries can recover. And maybe what the US is intending here is some sort of new space race, but commercially driven rather than government driven. And in some ways, if the race is to develop viable technology to mine the moon, because we have to remember that at the moment, we're not very good at even bringing back small rocks from the moon, let alone actually mining it, turning it into something we can use for something else, and then selling it. There's a lot of investment that's going to have to go into developing that technology. And I guess in some ways, commercial uses of space, while they may not be as satisfying philosophically as cooperative scientific uses of space, in a way, at least we're not bombing each other.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. The United States has always had a strategy of encouraging its private enterprise to develop technology. Now, in the earlier days, the United States was very good at doing that because they saw that as a way of developing and then maintaining what it's perceived as being a superiority in space. And clearly that strategy and that reasoning still exists, but I think there's an added layer that you referred to, which is the hard fact of commercial necessity. Governments, because of we see that with the dual use nature of space increasingly, governments all around the world, basically, cannot necessarily afford themselves to do all this, and they need to partner with non-governmental entities. In the United States, of course, there's been great development since, for example, the shuttle program stopped. There's been great encouragement by the government for private enterprise to be involved in delivering that taxi service back to the space station through SpaceX and perhaps others. So the government, it's a dual prong. The government needs private enterprise to develop the technology, to make the country stronger, to aid in national security, but it's also perhaps increasingly a commercial reality that the government needs private enterprise involved because they need private enterprise capital. And I said, as you said, and I've said, the current situation only exacerbates that. The statement, the executive order, also in a couple of places makes reference to applicable law. So it just reinforcing the point, and this was also in the 2015 law that about the Obama administration, under the Obama administration, where it said it purported to give these rights to Americans to do these particular things and get some ownership rights, subject to America's obligations under international law and any other applicable law, words to that effect. And here, even though it doesn't talk about America's obligations under international law, it talks about applicable law. The fact is, it's in the same statement where they've reinforced the fact that the Outer Space Treaty is applicable and will apply. So it maintains that circularity. The circularity is this. Yes, any country can do this. It's not just the United States. Any country can pass law saying you can do this activity under our national law. We regard this as lawful, but subject to any other applicable law, including international obligations that we as a country might have or whatever. And of course, the United States, like all the other major spacefaring countries, are bound by the Outer Space Treaty. This maintains that circularity, and it begs the question then, what is the international legal position? And I think the main point about this statement on that is the United States saying, we understand there is law, but it's not in the Moon Agreement. And let us make that clear so there can be no misunderstanding. But we understand there is law, and as I said, it therefore calls for a discussion about, okay, how we develop a framework. That framework clearly, as the United States has said that they don't see it as being by way of a binding treaty. Well, of course, binding treaties, we haven't had a binding treaty in the space regime since the Moon Agreement, but in many other areas, we're not going to get binding multilateral treaties in the geopolitical environment we're at. So that's not necessarily saying something that should make us all aghast. I mean, again, in theory, wouldn't it be great if we could all agree and have something in binding? But it's not going to happen. But that's not saying there won't be some understandings and frameworks that we have to abide by. And so I don't want to appear as if I'm putting too positive a gloss on this. Clearly, there are things in this executive order that personally one might disagree with, and certainly other countries will disagree. But I don't see it as being something that radically changes what we already know about the position of one of the major spacefaring countries in the world. There are some troubling things in here from the perspective of other countries, but I don't necessarily think there's anything particularly new in here, although, as we discussed, the language is a bit more strident.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think at first step, when you read something like this, I'm not sure if you did debating when you were back in school or anything, but I certainly did. And there's this debater in me that reads these things and instantly starts, unpicking it line by line and wanting to refute every single thing. But I think it's good to take a step back and think about, well, what is the end result that is acceptable to everybody? What, from a negotiating position, does good look like? And does this actually stand in the way of that? I think in some ways, the options for the US, if they wanted to provide certainty and clarity for their space resources industry, was either to say, okay, yes, you can do it, and we're using what's in the Moon Agreement as the basis for that, or to say, yes, you can do it, and we're not using the Moon Agreement. And from the US's perspective, I can totally understand why the Moon Agreement was not something they wanted to sign up to randomly in 2020, having spent decades saying that it wasn't a good idea.
For your listeners, there are 5 space treaties that under the auspices of the UN, but the United States, and it's not the only country, but the United States has always talked about 4 core treaties. So they've never even given this treaty the same status in their mind. So, but the language here is strident and some would say unfortunate. But there's nothing new if you understand the context. And I think a lot of people will comment on this and say this is a moment that we will never forget in the history of geopolitics in space, and this has changed everything. Some might say that, and they will do exactly as you said, look at it line by line, and say, well, I agree or disagree with that or whatever. But I think you need to look at it in the context. I'm not at all saying that this helps the debate, but I'm certainly don't think that it is something that will completely destroy the fact that we need to move forward in some way, shape, or form. And even the United States in the order talks about the fact that it's entitled getting international support. So immediately it's talking about not a unilateral approach. It does, of course, talk about like-minded states. So there's language there of geopolitics. But one of the great criticisms of the 2015 law when it was passed, amongst some commentators, was this was unilateralism by the United States. Now, I don't know, but I don't think this is a unilateral. They're not saying we're going alone. Clearly, they're saying we may pick and choose who we go along with, and this is the basis upon which we would go along. But one never knows how this will play out. Of course, we must talk about the Moon Agreement because there are 18 states parties to the Moon Agreement, and including the country that you and I both live in. And I don't think there's a statement in the executive order that says that rejects any notion that the Moon Agreement represents customary international law. Now, but perhaps some of your listeners may not. Customary international law is a difficult thing to prove in terms of its existence, very difficult. And you described it very well in your podcast yesterday. But the fact of the matter is, apart from the odd commentator, there's been very little advocacy for the fact that the Moon Agreement is customary international law. It's binding, and it's certainly binding on all of the parties to it, including Australia. But I cannot recall any of the member state, the parties saying it represents customary international law. And I cannot recall, I stand to be corrected, a statement being made by a country that the Moon Agreement represents customary international law. And under purely theoretical objectivity in terms of working out what customary international law is, and all of the tests that all of the cases have given rise to, it would be a very difficult argument to run anyway. Again, they're making it clear that they would reject that notion, but I don't think that notion has been pushed very hard anyway.
Saying that the Moon Agreement represents customary international law would be a big call to make, and not really backed up by any evidence, other than maybe the greatest hopes of those who love it. But saying that it is at the same time potentially a starting point for a way of approaching the discussions, or some sort of maybe create some sorts of norms or language terms that can be thrown around in discussions, that it's nonetheless useful, I think. And if anything, this executive order says to me, and I don't know if it says this to you, that if and when when those UN COPUOS legal subcommittee discussions resume, and we do get together and talk about how we want to do resource management and resource use in outer space, in many ways, this says to me that the US is very excited about those discussions and potentially willing to come to the table with some constructive ideas. And if and when that does occur, then the Moon Agreement can be something that is used to say, well, here's how it's been expressed in the past, or here's how we might think about it, and then can be the basis from which a discussion happens that may not end up being what the Moon Agreement says, but still means that the Moon Agreement itself is not a completely useless document or useless idea. Do you think I'm being too generous to the Moon Agreement?
I slightly disagree with you there.
Yeah.
I mean, I may agree with you personally,
Sure.
but I think there's something, I don't have the executive order in front of me, but there's something that I read either in the statement or in the order, I think it was that says it was an inappropriate way, the Moon Agreement was an inappropriate way of trying to direct. So I think there are certainly some interesting lessons that we can learn about any way forward from what's in the Moon Agreement. And of course, everybody should read it, even if you then want to discard it. But I think to the extent, and this may not happen, but to the extent we actually do say, well, this little bit here might be useful as an idea to develop the discussions, even if that's the case, I don't think there'll ever be an acknowledgement that we're taking an idea from the Moon Agreement, certainly not from the United States.
I don't think anyone would expect that.
Yeah, so in that regard, I disagree with you slightly, because I don't think people will say, hey, let's look at this idea in the Moon Agreement and let's apply it. I think people will look at the idea in generalities, and it may well coincidentally be something that's in there. So it's just more a question of language. I don't think there'll be reference. But if you look at the statements made by in 2008 or 2009, pardon me if I've got the year wrong, 8 of the states parties to the Moon Agreement, and that did not include Australia, but submitted a statement to legal subcommittee of COPUOS about the benefits of being a party. Now, again, that is not going to encourage the United States to become a party, but they were talking about the benefits of having an understanding about a way forward, and yet, in their opinion at least, that is the states parties, there was complete flexibility in the Moon Agreement. Now, in a sense, no matter what they think, that's not going to encourage the United States to sign up. But the point being that there is at least an understanding, at least amongst those 18, of a way forward, is a benefit, because in the end, you and I have talked about this before. In my opinion, this issue, the issue of the exploration, exploitation, and utilization of space, is in a sense a defining issue about how we think of space, how we move forward. It changes the way that we think about space. I've said in other contexts that, in my personal opinion, it would be unfortunate if we just think of space as a place to exploit and garner benefits. And I don't just mean minerals, but I mean in any other way. And I think I gave that talk that made that point in the context of somebody trying to put advertising in space through a series of sales. I think it would be unfortunate if we tend to just think about space as a place to exploit and take from, because we all understand space is so much more than that, and the future of humanity in so many ways is tied up to the way we talk about space. So, I think we have to be careful that as we move forward in whatever way, shape, or form on this particular issue, it's too big for one country, or even perhaps a small number of countries, in a sense, to dictate the way it moves forward. Totally. because it is so defining about the future of space. And let alone, as you mentioned, the incredible technological, economic, cultural, social challenges and everything else associated with these sorts of activities. It really, if nothing else, screams out for multilateral cooperation. I mean, look, for example, at the International Space Station, which is an incredible thing, but it is, perhaps the numbers don't stack up now, but certainly for its time, it was by the largest international multilateral project ever. And it needed to be for it to actually happen, right? And what we're talking about now, as wonderful as the space station is, what we're talking about now is so much more challenging and so much more capital intensive and in so many ways that no small number can really do this on their own. That said, everybody, of course, is wanting to maximize their own positions. Geopolitics, as you and I have talked about many times, and you specialize in this, geopolitics drives all of these discussions, but there's also a common interest realization that I can't do it alone. It's impossible for me to do it alone. That doesn't mean I can't be strident in my language. And of course, the United States is not the only one who has plans to do this. Other major countries and other countries also have plans under their own programs. And I think the same goes for them as well. So we shall see. I think in the end it'll be difficult. Nobody ever thought it would be easy. It'll be very difficult, but we need to sit down and talk about this. We will disagree. We will disagree stridently, but in the end, in other areas of space where we've disagreed, we've come up with solutions. It takes time, of course. And I think at some point we'll come up with solutions, whatever they may be. And we know that the United States doesn't want it to be a treaty. I don't think it would be a treaty, given geopolitics, but that doesn't mean that there won't be a way forward. But there'll be some very, very interesting and robust discussions on the way to that. But then again, notwithstanding what industry is saying, I think we're still a little bit away from this being something that's going to happen tomorrow.
And I think that's really good news in that we've got time to have this discussion. And in some ways, this executive order is, if you were to summarize it in very small words, it would be something like, we need to talk. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can turn into something really positive. I think space has always challenged humanity physically and philosophically and conceptually. And I think that this case of resource use and exploration and so on will be no exception. But I do think that overall I'm feeling very positive about the potential that this particular incident and no doubt others to come will, the fact that it'll bring us together, it'll bring us to the table, we'll have discussions, and I'm sure that we will reach some consensus on something eventually that will be very positive.
I hope so. I mean, we need all of the major countries at the table. We certainly need the United States at the table. I mean, the United States is still, so important in being there to help in the development of the way forward. But so are other countries as well. I agree with you. People will listen to us and they may think we're both being a bit too optimistic or naive. And that perhaps, a few countries, a small number, can do this without an understanding. But we already have this acknowledgement that the Outer Space Treaty applies, and any other applicable law, and that in and of itself will mean that we need to discuss, because there are differences in the way some might interpret what the Outer Space Treaty itself says. And so we need clarity. This is about clarity and certainty. In fact, that's what the statement says, that accompanying the executive order. It's about providing clarity and certainty. But yet, because it has this circularity about, in accordance with applicable law, that is the uncertainty that in the end we need to try to work forward. So I think we just have to remain positive that we will find a way forward, but it's going to be very difficult. I mean, nobody can pretend that this executive order will make the geopolitical part of this easier. It probably makes it harder, because its forthrightness and stridency will give rise, and we've already seen one or two responses, will give rise to forthrightness and stridency from others who don't support. But we saw that in legal subcommittee, as I mentioned, in response to the 2015 legislation, and yet a short number of years later, we got to the point where we were going to have these discussions, subject to COVID-19. So, we shall see. It's an interesting time.
I'm conscious I've taken a lot of your very interesting time myself. So, Stephen, just before we wrap up, is there anything that you would advise people go and read or look at if they want to know more about this issue of resource use or anything to do with space law?
Yeah, I think, certainly people should read the Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Agreement. I know that rather than read the Moon Agreement, they can hear you reciting the Moon Agreement, which I think is wonderful. There's lots of really interesting academic commentary on the Moon Agreement and on the treaty regime. There are a series of books that came out of the University of Cologne called the Cologne, they're called COCOSIL, the Cologne Commentaries on Space Law, 3 volumes. That volume 1 goes through the Outer Space Treaty article by article. Volume 2 goes through the other 4 treaties, including 150 pages on the Moon Agreement, article by article. And then volume 3 looks at some of the resolutions. I think that's a really good point to look at. I think they were published perhaps 2011, 2012, but still really good reading. But there's lots of academic reading. I think people could quite easily, and it's look at the debates that have gone on in COPOS, perhaps over the last 1 or 2 or 3 years on this issue, and you'll see there's already been a wide-ranging, rich debate with many different points of view, but it's not as if this is, as I say, a bolt out of the blue. If you read those commentaries, it doesn't name what the particular states that express views, but you can work out to a certain degree that what's said in the executive order, as I've said, is not particularly new and not in any way really significantly differing from previous expressions by the United States. But you'll also read, expressions by other countries and other views. And I think that would give people a broader context, because it's all about context. If you looked at this document, just if you looked at one article of one treaty in isolation, or if you look at this document in isolation, of course this will be your eureka moment of, wow, look at this, everything is changing. But we've been talking about space for a long time, and context is everything, and understanding history is everything. So there are many sources, and of course listen to your podcasts, because I'm sure you'll be speaking to a lot of people about this issue as well.
I certainly hope so. Stephen, thank you so much.
And it's always a pleasure, and thank you. And again, I wish you well and everybody who's listening in these difficult times, and hopefully we will all have the opportunity to meet at some point face to face at some point. So thank you.